process, and we're sharing in our VIP exclusive green room that so many of us suffer from it and we don't know what triggers us or maybe what we're going through. So do me a favor, let's jump right into this. Introduce yourself and tell my audience a little bit about who you are.
Okay, so I'm Kelli Anderson, and I'm a pretty seasoned trauma therapist and have had kind of a unique perspective on trauma because I have seen it from a lot of different perspectives. So, just kind of to set the foundation of where I'm coming from. So, as a social worker and a therapist, I have interacted with trauma in many different spaces. For instance, like the nonprofit humanitarian world. I've been, in developing countries where you see intense trauma. I've worked in the where we rescue children from trafficking. So you see trauma in those perspectives. I've worked in the hospital, either emergency rooms or people are passing away or they've received a chronic diagnosis. And then I've also sat in United Nations Human Rights Council meetings and heard about like the atrocities that are happening around the world. And so anytime I talk about trauma, I'm kind of in all of those diverse settings and I own my own practice now where I work with women who have experienced trauma. So I feel like as a therapist, I've had a very unique view of what trauma can look like in many different spaces. And I'm also an author. I'm a new author of a book that's called Walk With Me, A Trauma Therapist's Journey, Transforming Trauma into Hope and Healing. And that part right there, transforming trauma into hope and healing, is really the focus of my practice and my focus of the messaging of trauma, that you can get to the other side of it.
Perfect. So I guess my first question for you is, why did you get involved in this?
In the trauma work, yeah. So I've always been, so I definitely had some childhood trauma, and recognized the impact that that had on me. And that's probably what pushed me more into the social work world. And I've always had this desire to help relieve pain from people who are suffering. So I went originally into like the nonprofit humanitarian space. And then I actually became more specialized in trauma interventions. Interestingly enough, I was working for an organization that rescues children from trafficking, and I was presenting at the United Nations about interventions that help those who've gone through trauma. And that pivoted me where I'm like, I want more training on this and go deeper on this so that I can help people individually or through a book to get to the healing pieces of trauma, to recognize what the impact was. And then now, okay, what do you do to create a happier, healthier life coming out of trauma? And then in my adulthood, and this is, part of my what I write in the book, I did have a very significant trauma in adulthood and had to apply all the tools and resources that I teach everybody else and what that journey was like for me.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that last part because I was speaking to someone who's a trauma mentor, trauma coach,
Mhm.
and they're like, Terrain, you'd be surprised how many people who are helping those through trauma have experienced trauma
Right.
themselves.
Absolutely. And we, in the therapy world, we kind of joke about, okay, what was your trauma, your negative experience that motivated you to want to not, there's this great desire that people don't feel the type of pain or you want them to be survivors and thrivers, right? And there is motivation in that. And I will say, I was a trauma therapist before I actually experienced my it was like a really severe traumatic experience, and I am a deeper trauma therapist now because of my own experience and how I had to work through it. And so that empathy piece is real, as we go into trauma work and trying to help others.
So, what do you think then is some of the obstacles that people face when they're looking to identify how trauma impacts their life?
Right. So, oh, that can vary, but sometimes is the ones that I have seen show up are there is a resistance to even identify or want to contribute that someone's not in control of their behaviors, that something else is, like someone from the past or some trauma is. And so they don't want to um, identify that they're not in control of it when a lot of times they're not. The behavior, the action, their reactions are based on other people or other traumas. Um, the second one um, is, going through trauma therapy, you stir a lot of things up. It takes a lot of time. It takes, sometimes we see things that we didn't want to see, and we have to put in a lot of work. Working through trauma takes a lot of work. And sometimes it's time and money also, right? Like, yeah, it takes effort. And sometimes people don't, they're not in a position or they're not ready to take on that kind of commitment.
I remember a time where I had to address my trauma, and it wasn't necessarily that I was ready to address it. It was
Mhm.
ready to be addressed.
Yes, it came to
Right?
you. It had to be
It came
addressed.
to me. Yeah, it
Yeah,
had to be addressed, right? And
right.
sometimes when I look at like addiction, whereas at that rock bottom, they're like, okay, now you essentially have to do something, right? And I
Yeah.
wonder sometimes, I want to get your perspective, is trauma like that a little bit where for some people, for many people, maybe that when they're addressing it, it's because they can't fall any further into it.
Yeah, so sometimes that is true, and other times they can come in because, say it's like a marital issue, or there's some conflict going on at work or with a family member or something like that, right? Or they're just not happy. And then I can actually, excuse me, then connect for them the trauma pieces that are coming into play with that. So it may not necessarily be that they, obviously there's this subgroup where, yeah, there's a crashing, you have no way but to address it. And then other times it's showing up in other ways that they don't recognize, that that's kind of their crashing moment or their shifting moment.
Can that be scary for some people to come face to face with their own trauma
Mhm.
and how they're going to maybe overcome it when they can't run away from it anymore?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And if, like you said, with the addiction piece, is once you start recognizing the negative impacts it keeps having, um, everybody has a choice. Either we're going to make the change or we're going to keep living the way that they're living. And some people will keep choosing to do it the hard way, right? But this other way is the better way, and that is to work through it, learn new skills, learn what we're not in control of in regards to our behaviors and reactions because we're in trauma responses. But it does it does take work. I mean, and like I said, sometimes people just aren't ready or they don't feel that they have the capacity to do it at that time.
If I were to look at, let's say, look at myself, who, when I described that situation, I was in my 20s and in my mid 30s now.
Mhm.
So sometimes I look back and I was like, I was fortunate that it happened sooner than
Mhm.
later in life, right? Because 20 is pretty young to come face to face with, okay, you literally have to make a decision because you're at the fork in the road in your life.
Right.
Now, sometimes when I look at maybe some of my past romantic relationships, they were going through what they were going through, but being the partner of someone who is at the doorstep of confronting their trauma or maybe going through a recovery process, how difficult can that be for the partner who is in a
Mhm.
relationship with them, observing it, and maybe impacted by it?
Right. So it can be very challenging. And at this point, even in my private practice, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients, right? So I have a pretty good perspective of what can happen. And anytime anyone goes into therapy, it is going to shake up other relationships. You just, because you're not stagnant, you're in motion, and things are going to come to light. And so it is a partnership process, and hopefully, sometimes things that can happen in therapy is you start a process with someone to work on their trauma, or they're recognizing that some of their trauma is becoming from their partner's trauma, right? Like that can be real. That you then you start to understand, like, is this other partner willing to be on this ride? Because it's going one way and that's like the cleanup process. Or is there going to be more of a separation because one's ready to change and one isn't ready to look at everything and clean it up? And honestly, that can be an interesting process as a therapist to watch, because I know that anybody who lands on my couch, if they are married, the point of trauma work is to stir things up. Like, we want to stir up, we want to look at things because we want to settle it back down in a pattern that feels healthier and brings more joy and more peace. Um, but the partner, if they didn't want to be along for the ride, they're in the story, so they're there. They're so yeah.
You mentioned like the impacts of the relationship. So what are maybe, because that's tough. Like I'm just putting myself in that situation. Like
Mhm.
you've created a life. We're taking a healthy relationship, right?
Sure.
So
Hmm.
you've created a life with this person. You love this person. You spent a lot of time with them, and then at some point in the relationship, there's you identify that they're struggling with someone. Like someone in the duo is struggling with something, right?
Right.
You want to be there for them,
Hmm.
but a part of them maybe is pushing you away.
Hmm.
And now you have this conflict like, okay, you have done the work. You maybe want them to do the work, but just because you want it for them doesn't mean that they're going to want it for themselves. Like, how do you coach both
Hmm.
to understand that the end goal is a better union between the two,
Right.
but one person may get it a little bit sooner. Someone would take a little bit longer.
Hmm.
Someone might have to struggle, and that's going to impact the other person. Like, take us through that process. How do you get them in the mindset to understand that there's going to be some bumps, some big
Right.
ones, some small ones, but you both can get through this?
Go through. So so my work starts with an individual, right? So say I'm working with a client. When I talk to them about the process we're going to go through, I start with that of like, okay, we're going to stir things up, and people around you are going to feel off balance, because what happens in relationships, especially in partnerships or family dynamics, right, is we all are used to patterns. Like, you do this and I'm going to do this. You do that, I'm going to react this way. You do this, then we're going to make up this way, whatever it is, right? So you have these patterns, and you also have your roles. And a lot of times we're in these relationships and roles, and we're just doing it subconsciously. We're just like right there doing it, right? When you start identifying it and you start shifting it, other people who are in those roles and relationships are being shifted, whether or not they like it, right? So it's naturally going to happen. So then the next question, so then if I bring in then the partner at a certain point, um, this actually becomes can be a pretty clear situation with partnerships, of really understanding this, of like, are we on different growth paths? And can I be patient? Can the person who's trying to grow, who's trying to do the transformation, we do talk about that patience, that this person didn't really have a choice. Like, they're just being brought into it, right? They're being shifted into it. The goal, hopefully, with the partner is, yes, I want to grow too, and we want to grow as a couple. But of course, every now and again, you do get a situation where one wants to grow and transform and the other one doesn't. And that can cause more conversations to be had at that point.
Yeah, like I've talked to a few people and they said terrain relationships end.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And I've seen them end. Yeah. Sometimes even, and these are really intriguing situations for me, where I can have, a woman come in, and I'm asking, one of the screening questions is, tell me about the relationships. And the answer is, oh, my spouse and I are great. But when we really start getting deeper and the patterns, and maybe they've perhaps been in a narcissistic relationship they didn't realize, or there's some type of underlying abuse that they weren't realizing, or they're really not communicating in a healthy way, but they were used to it because they grew up that way. And when they start shifting that or asking something different from their partner because they need something healthier, I've absolutely seen marriages end because they both can't grow the same way, you know. And I mean, of course, that's disheartening to see that. But it's really intriguing to me, though, how a partner can come in, like a woman can come in thinking that she's unhappy or she's having these distressing symptoms like panic attacks and things, but never associating it with her partnership, when in reality it is about the partnership, something in the partnership, whether their trauma or some conflict of the way they're interacting together because of their trauma responses.
That what you just described, that last piece reminds me of a relationship where I was in that after a period of time, whenever I was around that person, I felt like a bit of anxiety. Like I started to feel warm
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, what's going on? And then when I would see their name in my phone, instead of
Yeah,
burst of joy and happiness, I'd be like, oh
right,
yeah, right. And
right.
then I look back, my body was telling me what my mind was
Yes,
maybe ignoring.
right,
Do you see
right.
that as well?
A lot of that. So it's really intriguing to me. I just always am amazed, like how many people are walking around really in kind of they're just automatically in motion without really thinking about how they really want to be acting, how they want to be engaging in life, how they want to be responding. We're just kind of in this autopilot of what's been programmed, past events, past experiences, whatever it is programming us to be this person and we're not challenging it. But part of that is going to what you said is we're not listening to how what our bodies are actually telling us. Like a partner, I could again have a client where when I'm really digging into it, she's feeling panic before her husband walks through the door, but she's not identifying that as like a trauma response or that there's something bad there. It's just she's just used to it. And I'm like, okay, for the most part, our bodies, for the most part, should be in what we call this window of tolerance, right? I don't know if you've heard that term before of like, we can just handle things and we're okay and our bodies feel okay. Once we're going into the panic, anxiety, kind of like what you were talking about, this uncomfortable space or we're withdrawing, anytime we're shifting into that, we should be questioning what's going on in this relationship or what's going on because something's off balance. Most of the time, like you were saying, people don't pay attention to it and they just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. Same thing over and over and over again. And not knowing the tools and resources that can shift that where their bodies can feel at peace or they can change the relationship or walk away from a relationship where they're not feeling their bodies cannot feel peace, right? Like, so I'm glad you noticed that because there's so many people who don't notice it.
I did because it was it made me uncomfortable and I don't like to be
Mhm.
uncomfortable. So what I do a lot of is many times I'll sit just by myself, cell phone ringer off, TV off, everything, and I'll just think, right? And I'll think, okay, how did my day go? How could I have made it better? What didn't go well? What could I have impacted? What I have control over? What I don't? And there's some times where I would come to that conclusion. I was like, okay, it's my responsibility to soothe myself,
Yeah.
right? And that could be a number of things, right? So if I'm not able to resolve a situation, I have to ask myself, or I will ask myself then, okay, so what is contributing to it? Is it a
Mhm.
person? Is it a behavior? Or is it a situation? And there's times where I had to get rid of friends because it was a
Yes.
person, right? And
Mhm.
there's times where it was a behavior, and then you have a conversation because I think sometimes, a lot of times, I think actually, people don't intentionally mean to make
Right.
you upset or bother you or stress you out, right? So I share that because when you describe the situation and you said that it was good to identify that, I wonder then sometimes what do you think is preventing people from acknowledging what their body is telling them or acknowledging what they're seeing that
Right.
is impacting themselves?
So I think, one of the things about trauma and this whole recognition of even like paying attention to our bodies is a newer concept, even in the therapy world, right? Like back in the 80s, we didn't even, PTSD was like, what is even PTSD and what is, and we didn't realize like all the impact that our past really has on our present. And so I think part of it is still genuinely, I think a lot of the community, and I can just say for, women who land on my couch, who are here for therapy, genuinely still don't understand how trauma impacts, how the body absorbs it. And we're still kind of in this pioneering stage in the communities and with individuals.